Namaskar, everybody. Some of you I recognize, some of you I don't. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name's Amal. I'm a teacher in a new humanist school, actually, in New York, and we run that school from kindergarten to 8th grade, so until the kids are approximately 14 years old. And that's really fun, but we definitely have our hands full. But it's really beautiful because these ideas of new humanism, which I'm going to be going over today in just a very basic way, um, really are ideas that are actually the most powerful when we instill them in the minds of young people, because it's really during those formative years that you can have the most impact. Okay. And so we try to offer them, a rigorous education while also, trying to craft a curriculum around these ideas, where these ideas are the base, so that it informs their discussions of history or science or whatever subject they happen to be covering. So let me share my screen with you guys really quickly. Okay. Okay. So today I'm going to be doing an introductory session into neo-humanism. And then at the end of the class, you guys are actually going to give me some feedback to let me know what you happen to be interested in, which is going to be very interesting for me. And then I'm going to adjust next week based on what I get from you guys as feedback. And it'll be really interesting to see where we go from that. But today we're talking about embodying knowledge for a better tomorrow. And the reason I talk about the embodiment of knowledge in a particular way is because I think when it comes to philosophical ideas, even spiritual ideas, it can often sound really nice out there in the abstract. But then the question always arises as to how do I make these ideas real? And it's incredibly difficult to adopt a new set of values, okay? Because often, just like in society, within your own self, real change doesn't come from the top down. It doesn't often come by you saying artificially, this is what I think, this is what I believe, right? Change comes from the bottom up, okay? And in the case of yourself, maybe it comes from the deepest part of yourself outwards, okay? And so new humanism really tries to address these very fundamental questions at the core of our hearts and asks us to practice on them in such a way where over time we begin to naturally more embody these ideas so that they are sustainable for us into the future, that it's something that we actually practice in the world so that it's not just a nice sounding idea. So in this presentation, I want to focus on three things in particular with neo-humanism, which is the way in which it addresses identity, progress, and story. And this is really fundamentally related to three rudimentary questions, I would say. For identity, that question is, who am I? For progress, where am I going? And the story aspect of it is, what am I doing here? Okay. There's a lot of tension these days in the world between scientific perspectives and spiritual perspectives. And a lot of it has to do with these fundamental questions and the ways in which we're trying to answer them fundamentally being at odds with each other. And neo-humanism has a really unique way of addressing these issues in a non-dogmatic, non-doctrinal way. And it starts with that fundamental question of who am I? Identity gets talked about a lot in the culture right now. It's kind of this hot button word. But if you listen closely as to what people mean when they say identity, they're usually talking about an aspect of themselves that is not, it's more at the surface of their personality than it is deep within the core of who they really are. Like an aspect of my identity, for example, that I could use when somebody says, "Who are you?" and often how you would respond when you think about the word identity is I would say, I am a Mexican American. Okay. Because that it from by answering that question, especially if you know a little bit about, what the United States is like in American culture, you can infer certain things as to what my life was like growing up, what my life experience has been, what some of my values might be. And so these are all really important signifiers. Like it does say something about me, but it doesn't speak to any aspect of myself that is so deep within my heart that it remains unchanging throughout my life. Because even that term, Mexican American, that is not something that I was in touch with when I was a child. I didn't grow up as a 5-year-old thinking I'm a Mexican American. I grew up with that personally, not really getting in touch with that until I was a teenager when I began to face a little bit of racism at school and people started treating me a particular way because I was Mexican American. And then I got in touch with this aspect of myself that really isn't even about me, but about how people perceive me. And so that's my point. Like when we talk about identity, we can talk about how old you are, your gender, your sexual orientation, your race, your ethnicity, your cultural heritage. All of those things are important and they inform who you are and how people perceive you in the world. But how much deeper can we go? Is that really all that you are? I'm 36 now. I'll be 37 next year. I wasn't a father last year. I am a father now. There's so many aspects that make up this idea of who I am, and they're constantly changing. And they change so much that it's very difficult to say that any one of these aspects really capture the truth as to who I really am. And so if we really want to talk about identity in a deeper way, we're going to have to go deeper than those social signifiers of sex and gender and orientation and race and so on. Okay. And then once we have a firm foothold as to what we mean when we talk about identity from a new humanist perspective, then it becomes much easier for us to talk about these other questions about where are we going? What are we doing here? And it becomes easier to talk about that in a way that is personal and makes sense for you, as opposed to a dogmatic or doctrinal belief that comes from the top down and tells you this is who you are, this is where you're going if you do these things, and this is what you're doing here. I've answered all the questions for you. This is something that you have to take upon yourself as a personal journey, something that you have to reflect upon for yourself every day and commit to every day, not just in your meditation, but as you conduct yourself in the world, in your relationships, and your livelihood. Okay? So, first, this idea of progress. Okay? Progress is another one of these hot button terms. But when you think about what it means that we are progressing, when you look about, I should actually get rid of this quote because it's going to be distracting. Hold on. I'll go to it in just a moment. When we talk about progress, what do we mean when we usually talk about progress today? We're usually talking about the progress of my iPhone 12 over my iPhone 11, or my iPhone 13 Max over my iPhone 12. It's got better specs. It's got higher resolution. I can take better photos with it. We talk about progress in terms of how my car goes faster, or there's a new medical technology that can help me. And all of these things obviously signify some kind of progress. But then the question arises, when we include other dimensions of ourself that are more than just the materialistic aspects of ourself, we can ask really difficult questions like, is my moral consciousness progressing as fast as my iPhone?
Amal,
Okay. Yes.
I have a request from the translators to
Go
leave
slower.
some pauses.
Okay. I'll pause for just a moment. My question, which is my moral consciousness progressing as fast as my iPhone, is obviously a little bit tongue in cheek. But it opens up a very real question, which is that look at how fast technology is progressing, in our history. I mean, I'm not even 40 yet. And when I talk to my sixth graders, I'm already at the age where I sound like a dinosaur because I remember a time when there was no internet. I mean, I could like adopt an old person voice when I say these things. I remember when there were no cell phones. It's just like the world changes and moves so fast, and that's happening at an accelerating rate. And I'm not trying to speak badly against that in any way, shape, or form. But when we are not progressing in the other aspects that make up who we are at the same rate, then that gap creates a problem. And that gap can be seen very clearly in some of the problems that we're facing today. For example, ecologists say that we are in the middle of what is called the sixth great mass extinction. What that means is that there are so many plants and animals going extinct right now that the rate at which they are going extinct is far higher than what happened when the meteorite hit the planet Earth 65 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs, which essentially means that humanity is now more destructive to the living systems of this planet than a meteorite, coming in from outer space. Okay, we are a catastrophe on the planet at the moment, but it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, new humanism is not an anti-humanist perspective. It's more about getting us to revitalize our sense of who we really are so that we can do a better job here on this planet so that we can become a positive and life-affirming presence on this planet. But right now, if you look at the problems that are existing in the world today, human beings are running up against the physical capacity of the earth to be able to handle what we are doing to it. And animals and plant species, very simply, cannot catch up. Okay. My father was born in 1954, and ecologists estimate that since the time that my father was born in 1954 up until now, 2021, 70% of the animals that were alive on the planet have ceased to exist. And what I mean by 70%, I don't mean 70% of the species. I mean, if you were to count all the animals, 70% of them are gone. Okay. And that's a tragedy. And that's only one thing that I'm choosing to focus on. I'm not even talking yet about the decimation of the old growth forests. We're losing, some people estimate that we're losing up to a football field's worth of forest every single second. I'm not even talking yet about rising sea levels, and the fact that my baby daughter, by the time she gets my age, there might be huge mass migrations of people from places like the Middle East because it's too hot to live there anymore. There's these immense challenges. And when you look at the root of it often has to do with the fact that our progress as a species is at the expense of the entire rest of the living community that we're a part of here, which shows us that our notions of what progress means and our notions of who we are, our notions of identity and progress are lacking. Okay, there's something about it that is not in balance with the way that the world naturally functions in a life-affirming and enhancing way. And so we have to adjust that, okay, if we want to move more boldly into the future as a positive force on this planet. So this is a great quote by the integral ecologist, Thomas Berry. He was also a Catholic priest. I'm pretty sure he was a priest, but I know that he was very Catholic, but he was an extraordinary person. And here's a really beautiful quote about that might as well have come out of a book about neo-humanism. I'll try to read it slowly. Human progress has been carried out by desolating the natural world. This degradation of the earth is seen as the condition for progress of humans. In other words, our progress happens in tandem with this degradation. The earth is a kind of sacrificial offering. A rectification is needed in the term progress. And Sri Sri Nandamurti, the propounder of neo-humanism, spends quite a bit of time talking about how we need to revision progress so that it's not like this. Progress is being used as an excuse for imposing awesome destruction on the planet for the purpose of monetary profit, even when the consequences involve new types of human, psychic, and physical misery. Progress according to what norms and for whom? The progress of a corporation is the deficit of the earth. And that's from a really fantastic and seminal work of his called The Great Work. Um, and so it shows the deficiency in the ways in which we think about that. And New Humanism addresses that, I think, in some really powerful ways. And it addresses that by talking about getting in touch with and learning to deepen and expand our notions of who we are. Okay? Because identity, we tend to talk about identity, maybe because of the sort of hyper consumeristic world that we're in right now. We tend to think about identity in terms of you, your atomized little self, as you exist distinct and different from everybody around you. Your identity has only anything to do with how you're different from your neighbors, how you're different from the people who live over there. You're different from everybody else, okay? And there is some value to calling attention to our differences so that we can treasure and celebrate our diversity, okay? I'm not speaking against that, but I am saying that if we're going to live in this big, diverse world of ours in a way that is actually peaceful and egalitarian, then it's going to require that we also learn to focus on what unites us in a deeper sense. What do I have in common with my neighbors? What do I have in common with the person who disagrees with me so fundamentally on everything about what it means to be alive that I barely can recognize that they're a person? What do I have in common with them? What do I have in common with my cat? What do I have in common with all of the living beings in this world? Okay. Identity is not just about you, it extends past you. Okay. Because when you think about who am I, we often turn to the sort of clubs that we're a part of, like I'm a man, I'm a woman, these are my social roles, things you have in common with other people also. Okay. And so the first way in which your mind tends to associate itself is with its family. Okay. There's a very strong sense of identity and connection that you feel with your family. And it's very intense, but it's also a little bit narrow. Okay. I want you to imagine what it would look like if your sense of self was so narrow, so narrowly defined that you only cared about your direct family and nobody else, to the expense of any other families that were out there. Okay, that shows how this identity, this identification with a group that extends beyond you, that's a blade that can cut both ways. On the one hand, that allows me to look out for the welfare of my family, to prioritize the welfare and well-being of my wife and my daughter. On the other hand, the other way that blade cuts is that if my sense of self is so narrow that it stops merely with my family, then the entire world becomes this sort of zero-sum game in which I'm constantly trying to take everything that I can at the expense of everybody else, as long as I can take care of the people that I care about. It's not a world that you want to live in. Okay. And so that tribal sense of self needs to extend out even further. And for most of us, the next way in which it tends to expand out and is fairly universal, is what Anandamurti calls geosentiment. And that is the sense of affinity I have for the place that I grew up and the place that I live and the place that I identify with. Okay. And again, just like every other aspect of identity that I'm going to talk about, it's a blade that can cut both ways. Okay. It's very natural for me to feel a sense of connection and a sense of identity and even a sense of pride with my home of New York. Okay. I actually like that I'm a New Yorker. I like other New Yorkers. I feel like I understand them and they understand me in a very easy way. When I've lived in many other parts of the world, and that feeling of culture shock is nearly universal. Even in California, which is the same country, I remember feeling like I was like on another planet. I couldn't believe, the cultural differences between California and New York. I remember sometimes I used to go to parties and just used to imagine what New Yorkers would say to some of the things I was hearing in a party in California. Okay, but that's a universal thing. Now imagine that my identity was so narrow that I only look out for the welfare of the people of my place. And that's something that you see in the world all the time. Okay, there's this intense association with geosentiment where here's this line in the sand, here's this river, here's this fence, and everyone on the other side of it is not like me. They are an other. Okay. And once you otherize the person who's on the other piece of land, there is nothing that your mind won't justify, no crime so heinous that you won't be able to find some rationalization for, because you will feel like you're acting out of a sense of welfare for the people that you identify with. And this is the danger of that identity. Okay. It is natural and it is beautiful to spread your arms out so that you have a sense of here are my people that I love and I look after. Okay. But there's something really dangerous and pernicious about that, because the moment those hands close, there's now an inside and there's an outside. There's an us and there's a them. Okay. And you don't have to look very hard at the history of this planet right up until 2021 to see the ways in which this geo-sentiment will hook up with sentiments regarding religion and politics and ethnicity and race to see absolute genocide, mayhem, catastrophe. Okay. And in many ways, the whole destructiveness of the 20th century was the dramatic failure of some of these geosentiment based ideologies failing on the world stage through the world wars. Okay. But then there's another sentiment that runs even deeper and can be even more dangerous, which is socio-sentiment. Okay. And I want to remind you that none of these are in and of themselves bad. It's not like it's a bad thing that I feel a sense of identification with my place. It's not like it's a bad thing that I do feel a sense of identification with people who feel like they're more similar to me, right? But if I begin to feel like this is my social group, this is my group, and then those other people out there are not like me, this is where the danger really begins to play out. In my country, for example, there have been just absolutely, hugely polarizing protests in the last 2 years regarding police brutality and race. And I have some level of sympathy, for people who have to be out there on the streets, enforcing laws in sometimes dangerous or violent circumstances. But if you look at the stories of a lot of these incidents with police brutality, it's truly horrifying. You have incidents, for example, with a little boy named Tamir Rice. I think he was something like 7 years old, just incredibly young. And he's playing with a toy gun. And there's even a video where this car speeds up, to this little boy, Tamir Rice, playing with a toy gun. And a cop jumps out and just shoots him dead within a couple of seconds. It happens so fast. It's just unbelievable. And you think about, like, how could anyone possibly do that? But once you move past your initial shock and horror, and you really try to analyze that from a neo-humanist perspective, why do you do something like that? It's because you have so fundamentally otherized the community that you're supposed to be protecting that you don't see yourself in the child who's out there playing. That child out there playing is not you. It's a threat. Okay. And this is where we see that it's so fundamental that we have to practice and learn to see ourselves in the so-called other. That child is my child. Even deeper than that, I am that child. There is no child in the world that is not mine, that is not me. See yourself in the other, and see, it's even harder maybe, is see the other in yourself. Can you recognize the thoughtless brutality of that person who shot down that child within you? Can you look in the mirror and recognize that there's an aspect of yourself that is so fearful and tiny and petty that it otherizes others to the extent that you don't even recognize their humanity sometimes? Okay, that's a very difficult process, but I would argue that it's fundamental to deepening your sense of self so that it can integrate and include in a positive and life-affirming way. But then here we can really see the true speciality of neo-humanism, which is that we have now gone so deep into the self that we talked about what we have in common essentially with all human beings. We're trying to extend our sense of self so far out that it includes the entire human community. But then neo-humanism goes further. It says, is that all you really are? Do you have something in some aspect of yourself that runs so deeply that you share something in common with an animal? That might seem like initially to many people a strange question. What do I have in common with an animal? And yet, if you look at it from another perspective, human beings are in relationships with animals all the time. Okay, how can you have a relationship with your dog, which you may love so much, if you have no part of yourself that you share in common with that dog? Human beings share a tremendous amount in common with the animals that we constantly act as though they have absolutely no sentience and absolutely nothing that we need to care about. And so that questioning and deepening of the self in new humanism goes so far that it eventually demands that you recognize that who you really are goes so deep that the only way to really get in touch with the true depths of that question, who am I, is to embrace something that is, sorry, I skipped past the species part, is to embrace something that is more spiritual, more cosmic, okay? And this is where we need to talk about how neo-humanism distinguishes itself from a more religious perspective. Because when I say that this is fundamentally a spiritual process, a spiritual idea, I don't mean a religious process. I don't mean a religious idea. I mean getting so deeply in touch with the ground of your being that you try to recognize that every single entity that you come in contact with over the course of a day, whether it's your friends or your family or a stranger or a plant, okay, you are all an expression of a singular being that is coming to know itself through this person or entity that is in front of you. And that is actually a scientific perspective. I can give you an example of how I try to teach neo-humanism to children. Is in 6th grade science, I teach them a lot about astronomy. And once you get into astronomy, there's no getting around the scientific fact that you are stardust, quite literally. The calcium in your bones and in your teeth were forged inside of a star. Every single, molecule in your body that came from the earth came from a star, okay? And in those stars, all of the elements are being cooked like a cauldron and then exploded out through supernovas. Even the food that you eat, if you're eating a plant, the sugar that is in that plant is converted sunlight. So you are stardust eating sunlight, okay? You are a cosmic being. You are the universe coming to know itself through your particular form, okay? The experience of a cat might seem incredibly alien and unusual to you, but the universe took billions of years to self-organize itself into this form of a cat that is now walking around trying to figure out the universe from the perspective of a cat. But because you're a human being, you can think of the ability of the human mind. It's almost like you're the mirror of the universe. You are the first being that we know of on this planet, at least, that has the ability to look back at the stars from which you were birthed, from which you are formed, and say, what the hell is going on over here? Okay. That questioning part of yourself that always wants to know more, that wants to go deeper, that wants to expand itself so that it includes everything. That spiritual urge for more, for expansion. Okay. That is in the nature of what it means to be a living being in this cosmos. And you share that in common. Okay. And so that new humanistic perspective is about going within and getting in touch with the ground of your own being, such that you try to recognize that the entire universe is the expression of one singular entity that is coming to know itself through these diverse forms. And what's interesting about that is everything that I just said, as spiritual as it might sound, there's nothing there that I said that is actually unscientific, right? Because from a scientific perspective, like I said, you are quite literally stardust that has over billions of years self-arranged its material components into your form, right? But we're not really taught that narrative in school generally. And this comes down to the notion of story. When you start with a purely materialistic idea of who you are, I am all of these superficial things that can change moment to moment. And then you have a very narrowly defined sense of self. And now you think, how do I progress in the world? I progress in the world at the expense of some other living being. I progress in the world by, dumping my nuclear waste over there, or by cutting down that entire forest because it's good for my short-term profits, or I really, it's really going to get me popular with the stockholders. That sort of progress. And now, what's the story that you are enacting through your life? Okay, it's one that is incredibly materialistic and divisive. Okay, and it leads to ecological destruction, to political chaos, and as we've seen through the history of the world, it always leads to bloodshed. It always leads to the expense of your people at the expense of another people. And fundamentally, what neo-humanism is about is developing an engine so that you can embody these very subtle ideas in a sustainable way. And the way in which neo-humanism talks about doing this, the means of doing this, the engine of that neo-humanistic outlook is devotion. And devotion is a scary sounding word, I think, to a lot of people in the 21st century who have developed a very rationalistic mentality, because we tend to associate devotion with sort of, religious ideas of I'm devoted to a sort of supernatural being that will bring me to a better place than this world after I die. Okay, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about getting in touch with the aspect of yourself that you share in common with the so-called others, and then trying to develop a heart-centered practice so that you feel within, not from without, but you feel from within that those people who are being exploited over there are mine people. They are me. I am them. Okay. That devotional outlook, which is essentially powered by love, okay, is something that can be maintained over time. Anandamurti, what he says about humanism, for example, which you could say is kind of the guiding ideology of the United Nations, for example. He says the fundamental defect of humanism is that it lacks what he calls a perennial source of inspiration. In other words, it can dry up at any moment because it's a nice idea, but if it doesn't come from the inside out, if it's not a heart-centered practice that is fundamentally based on love, then it's nice in theory, and then behind closed doors, of course, the petty internationalism that you see in the United Nations is always about what can I leverage against you so I can get my way. Okay, it's not a humanism at all. Okay, because it can't maintain that idea in practice. Okay. And so here is a really great quote from The Liberation of Intellect, which is the book in which P.R. Sarkar, Sri Sri Anandamurti first propounds the idea of neo-humanism. And I'll try to go slowly through it. The philosophy that is not motivated by any perennial source of inspiration. So perennial source of inspiration would be something that is constant. It's always there for you to go back to. That is not motivated by any perennial source of inspiration is bound to become a formality only, devoid of any real sincerity. It may die out at any moment, like a river which ends in the sands of the desert. So it must be motivated by a constant and perennial source of inspiration, which I call new humanism. When this new humanism operates in the external sphere, in other words, in the world, when you're living your new humanism, in other words, then internal devotion as a principle, the internal devotion that you try to cultivate in your meditation practice, okay, in your day-to-day life, is then transformed into devotion as a mission. You are now a missionary. You have the zeal of a missionary, and those actions which ordinarily might cost you something, like it can be very difficult to sustain yourself as an activist because you're always putting yourself out there, okay, it becomes something that nourishes your devotional practice from within. It becomes like a positive feedback loop where you try to cultivate that devotion internally, you enact that devotion externally in the world, and the enactment of that devotion externally in the world through serving the so-called others helps you serve the deepest aspect of who you really are that goes way beyond any materialistic notions of age and sex and race. And that's why, like I said before, what this really comes down to, as simple and as difficult as it is love, real love. And so this is another quote that comes out of Liberation of Intellect. To build something on the basis of neo-humanism means to build something on the basis of real love for humanity. It is not possible to build a genuine society, one which is truly dedicated to collective welfare, if its most intelligent and active members constantly evaluate their contribution to society in terms of profit and loss. In a healthy society where the only binding ingredient, is genuine love, how will it be possible for coercion or legal compulsion to manifest this love, the true expression of society? And so that's exactly what I was talking about at the beginning, where I was saying how real change can't come from the top down. Okay. And that's as true in the world as it is within your own self. You know, changing who we are and so that we can be a medium for change and real progress in the world can't be about, telling myself, basically guilting and shaming myself all day long as to why can't I be better? Why can't I do this? I'm too this, I'm too that. It's not like that. The real change, which is sustainable, which you can continue in the future, it requires that perennial source of inspiration. It requires something that comes from the inside out. Okay, new humanism is not meant to just be a nice sounding idea. It's supposed to be something that you practice so completely and so constantly through your meditation, through whatever internal spiritual practice that you might relate to, and to the service that you try to enact in the world. And what I mean by service is not just going on some relief effort or some missionary effort, which can be incredibly wonderful. I mean also just the way in which you treat the people who are closest to you, your most intimate relationships. You continually enact that so that it continues to feed back into that internal practice, so that that love that you feel, okay, is something that you feel in your bones, okay, so that when you hear of the environmental degradation of the earth, that ceases to be something that you sort of hear out here like, oh, that sounds bad. That sounds like something that shouldn't happen, but something that strikes you right at the core of your heart. Like, oh my God, that's happening to, you begin to see the beloved in all the persons, human or otherwise, that are in front of you. so that anytime you encounter, you know, a so-called other, you see an opportunity, to serve the beloved that is coming to know itself through you and through them. Okay. And so new humanism is not just a philosophy. It's not just a worldview. It's fundamentally something that demands practice, and not just practice like a kind of mechanical practice, do this, do that. It starts at the deepest core of your heart and then goes from the inside out. And it seems like a very simple seed, right? Love can be used in a very trivial way, but with the umbrella of this philosophical outlook, it can also has an incredibly transformative quality that can completely change the way that you look at the world, and can completely change the way in which you conduct yourself in the world. And eventually, we'll get to a place in which you very naturally will see any political thing that's happening in the world, any ecological problem that's happening in the world, and you won't see it through the lens of your geosentiment, the lens of the country that you're from. You won't see it just from the lens of your ethnic heritage or your racial history, or your family. You'll see it through the lens of neo-humanism, and you will more naturally act from that place. Um, and that is worlds away from where the story is right now in our society. That question of what are we doing here? If you look at the narrative that is playing through the culture right now, it might as well be he with the most toys at the end of the game wins. Okay. It's just, there is nothing but matter in the story that we're being taught right now. And so the entire culture and economy is completely set up over how much of this matter can I procure? How much of it can I possibly get? Okay. And so, first of all, it's a fancy sounding word, which is anthropocentric. Anthropocentric very simply means it's completely centered on the human. Okay. We don't even give, it's barely an afterthought what we give towards how we might include animals and plants on this journey that we're all on. Okay. And it's only human centered in the most selfish of ways, because eventually we're going to kill so many plants and animals and cause so much destruction that it's also going to degrade our own lives. And we've already gotten there, as far as I'm concerned. The second thing that I would argue it is it's mechanistic. What I mean by that is the universe is not seen like an organism, like this incredible, great, unknowable mystery that is self-arranging and coming to know itself through all these different forms. There's nothing magical about it. There's nothing awesome about it. It's a machine. The universe is a machine. It's doing its thing very blindly, and humans are sort of this blind luck accident of evolution. And that's it. There is no purpose to it. It's just whatever meaning you make for yourself. And when you say life only has the meaning that you create for yourself, then there are the extraordinary souls out there who are so service oriented, they try to develop a life that is centered around making meaning that is more than just about themselves. But I think for the vast majority of people, what it does is it creates a situation in which meaning is the meaning that I create, where I'm the protagonist of my own movie. I'm the star everywhere I go. And so you see this incredibly narcissistic generation that's being raised right now. It's like the selfie generation. They're just, it's, the society right now has been completely atomized to the point where it's just you and your cell phone, and everybody out there on social media is better looking than you and living a life more interesting than yours. And you're constantly missing out. But don't worry, if you have enough money, you can purchase more, what you need to gain access and be part of the chosen people. Okay. It's very disenchanted. It's not, there's nothing there. There's no there. And the last thing I would say about that is that story is materialistic. There is absolutely no recognition of the sanctity of anything, because all that there is just dead matter accidentally interacting in these ways. Consciousness is seen as a sort of epiphenomenon, a sort of blind luck accident of the brain that will not survive, the death of the brain. And so, because there's no larger context that's given, this is a story in which essentially the earth is like a stage for human beings to live out their narcissistic, pleasure driven lives. There is no larger context in which human beings are embedded. And because of that, there's an incredible widespread sense, I would say, in the culture right now of alienation, of anxiety, of feeling like, there's a reason why a game like Squid Game, for example, is very likely the most popular show that Netflix has ever made, because there's a widespread sense that it's like nobody can get what they need to be able to live a life of basic human dignity. And so we're going to engage in this sort of Hunger Games where we kill each other to get to the top, where one winner takes all. Okay. Of course, that story is going to have tremendous resonance in this sort of late capitalistic age that we're in. Okay. But it doesn't have to be this way. Okay. But if we're going to shift that story, that's easier said than done, because it starts with every person and it starts from the inside out.